Hey guys, today I want to do a little video on how to edit log footage. I feel like there are a few misconceptions on how to go about editing log, and this is just hopefully going to be a short little video on how to get started on doing that. I really recommend watching Gerald Undone's video on editing log if you want a super in-depth pull apart of how to edit log, but I think this one should be nice and short and kind of maybe aimed at people who haven't been editing log for too long. So for those of you who don't know what log is, basically it's a format of recording which compresses your image and makes the dark parts a lot brighter and the bright parts a lot darker, so that you've got a real compressed flat looking image, which means you can do a lot to it in editing later. Now log has some awesome benefits, but if you haven't used it too much before, it can be a real pain to try and get the sort of just natural, clean looking image you were after to start with. Now to start off, I'd like to address the thing which I feel like people get wrong the most, and that's that they think that if they add contrast and saturation, they'll get it to a point which looks pretty similar to what you might shoot in a standard profile. That is definitely not the case, and adding contrast is the wrong way to go about things. This misconception often comes from people who take photos because when you're editing a raw image, the blacks are pretty black and the whites are pretty white. And so often if you just add a bit of contrast, that makes the darker parts a little bit darker and the lighter parts a little bit lighter. You've got a pretty nice image. But log is very different to that. In log, the darkest parts of the image are actually brought way up. So the blacks are not at all black and the whites are not at all white. So if you add a contrast curve, that means that you're only making the darker parts darker, but not the blackest point blacker. And you're not making the whitest point whiter, you're only making the lighter parts lighter. I'll show you what that looks like because it sounds a bit confusing. Okay, jumping into Final Cut Pro. This will be pretty similar for any editing software you use. They'll all have tone curves, so you'll be fine with that. But jumping into Final Cut Pro, I've already made a number of tone curves and things like that. This is what it would look like if you added contrast. It does an okay job, but basically the blackest points are not their blackest. As you can see, we're a little way off the 0 here, and we're not quite at the 100. It's separated a little bit, but not quite in the right way, and not quite the same way you'd see in a standard profile. So now I'll untick that. And this is a better sort of curve, something that separates things a little more and gives you, I guess, more tonal variation while still having complete white and complete black. So as you can see, I'm just clipping at the black level down here. We're just about touching 100 on your white point as well. So what I've done is I've pulled the blacks along and pulled the whites along this way, and I've added a tiny bit of a bit of contrast here. That's comes down to, I guess, more stylization. But if we're just trying to bring it back to a standard profile, we want to bring our black point along and our white point along instead of adding contrast. So now one way you can get a nice looking image out of log footage is by using LUTs. You can download it manufacturer's LUTs straight from Canon or Sony or wherever. But unfortunately, it does a good job, but it has some limitations, and I'll just show you the difference between using a curve that I would make versus using a manufacturer's LUTs. They're actually really similar. So what I've got here is log footage which has had the Canon LUT applied to it, and it looks pretty good. The image has been well exposed, so everything is perfect. I'm pretty happy with that. I can do some stylization now. Over here we have the tone curve I made, which is a super basic one. It's kind of like I said, I pulled the black along and the white along and then created a slight bit of contrast, but not too much. And it looks pretty much the same as what Canon has made. Now that works perfectly in good exposed footage with the right white balance and that kind of thing. But what I'll show you now is what it's like if you kind of screw that up a little bit. You might be a stop or two under or overexposed, and how LUTs are not the best way to go when that happens. This is just straight log footage with nothing applied, and we add a Canon LUT, it looks good. If we apply my tone curve, yep, it looks good. They look pretty similar, but then we'll go to some overexposed footage. Now this one I might have messed it up a little bit. Sometimes when you're run and gunning, things just aren't always absolutely perfect. You haven't had time to fully dial in the settings. So now we'll see if we can fix this. So I'll start applying the Canon LUT, and that looks pretty horrendous. We'll try and fix that by bringing down the exposure, and it helped, but as you can maybe see, the white point is no longer fully white. The blacks are looking okay, but basically the image is now compressed because we've brought down the exposure, so that's a bit of a problem. So now we'll bring that back up to normal, turn off the Canon LUT, and now I will use a curve which I have made to suit this footage, and it's not perfect. It's better to expose perfectly, but it is hugely improved. The white point is a lot whiter. Bright parts of the image are looking pretty good. Basically what I've done is I've left the whites where they are, but brought the blacks along still, and then created a slight bit of contrast in the lower part of the image, but left the brighter part of the image as it is. So now if we compare that to the properly exposed footage, so it's not perfect, but it's definitely closer. Maybe a white balance shift might help, but yeah, that's definitely improved. Now we'll go to something which I have underexposed significantly, and we'll see what we can do there. Once again, starting off with the Canon LUT, and that looks terrible. It's almost black in a lot of places. And if we try and boost the exposure up, it looks okay, but the black points are no longer entirely black, and yeah, just overall it's a little bit more mushy, not great. Now I'll drop that exposure down a little bit, and we'll try see what the curves do. Now the curves have separated things out a lot better. We're seeing a good black point. It's nice and contrasty in the dark parts, but we've still got some brightness to it. And all in all, looking between the three, they're not perfect, but for how different the exposures were, it's actually done pretty well, versus the Canon LUT, which basically was terrible. You need to do a lot more work in the end if you're using LUTs for trying to correct this sort of thing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not hating on LUTs. I love LUTs, especially for stylization. I like to try and correct my footage and then apply a more stylized LUT, which will mean that my project is more consistent from start to finish, but I don't agree with using LUTs to try and correct your footage, because that doesn't work a lot of the time. Now there's a lot more depth I could go into with this, but I wanted to keep this one on the short side. I recommend popping over to Gerald Undone's page if you're keen for a super nice in-depth video. But yeah, appreciate you watching, and let me know if there's anything else you'd like to learn, like to know about, and I'll do a video on that. Cheers.